It's my pleasure to introduce Roger Martin, and before I get into his resume, I'll just share how we got to know each other. And it was a great process that was started by the Aspen Institute several years ago. I see Mary Gentile, the Aspen Institute had some, great, they're really focused on business and society innovation. A real catalyst. They're changing the way business school rankings take place and so on. And they created a wonderful setting for all of us where they invited about 8 or 10 management schools to come together, schools that they thought were on the leading edge of a lot of this work in business and society relationships. And one of the schools, we were part of that, but one of the schools was University of Toronto, the Rotman School of Management. And that's where I met Roger Martin. And Roger is just a really rare person. He's the dean of the Rotman School of Management, but he also is able, and I don't know how he's able to do it, but he's able to continue to brilliantly write and think and continue to be a thought leader for the whole field of management. And that's really rare for a dean to be able to do that. Honestly, I don't know how you're able to do it, Roger, but he's very prolific. Roger's, prior to becoming a professor, he's the premier chair of management at the Rotman School. Prior to that, he was 13 years the director of a major corporation, the Monitor Company. So he comes at this work from an executive perspective, I think very, very thoughtful. His research has been in the areas largely of design and design thinking and integrative thinking. Business Week, he continues to work with a column and write columns for Business Week, and Business Week called him one of the world's innovation gurus. And I really believe that his thought and the way his mind works illustrates that. Many articles with Harvard Business Review, 2 degrees from Harvard, on many, many boards, and he's got a recent book out called, and he'll describe what these words mean, The Opposable Mind, How Successful Leaders Win Through Integrative Thinking, and then the other book that I love the title, The Responsibility Virus. So help me welcome to our school and this program, and thank you, Roger, for joining us. Roger Martin.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I mean, Case Western is, of course, incredibly lucky to have David here and all the other folks who are working on the design agenda. But wasn't Russ Acott, wasn't that fantastic? I just look at that and say, oh man, that was, yeah, wasn't that great? 90 years old and still contributing to knowledge in the world. It's impressive indeed. It's like Peter Drucker, who managed to do that till 94 or 95. Hey, what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about what I see as necessary to fix business education, with the particular emphasis on design and where design thinking comes into the picture. There are a bunch of things that have to be done to fix business education, but I'll attempt to focus more on that one. So I'll start out by making an argument that we should care about 3 important dimensions for business education. What we would want a business education to be is not narrow, but broad. Would we want our business students to come out being able to only see the trees and not the forest? No, we'd rather have them have an understanding that allows them to understand things in a broad way. 2, would we rather have them be shallow in their understanding of models, or deep? Obviously, deep. And what do I mean by this? We all have models that help us understand how to do things in life. If I use myself as an example of shallowness versus my son as an example of depth, my model for what to do when my computer freezes up, what do you think my model is? Turn it off, turn it on again, and what? Hope. And guess what? Often it starts up again for mysterious to me reasons. What about my 23-year-old son? What do you think he does when his computer freezes or program freezes? Well, he goes through a 10-step diagnostic process and reboots and who the heck knows, but but he knows exactly what he's doing. That's a deep understanding, a deep model of how his computer works versus my pathetically shallow model. So we'd rather have our students coming out with deep understandings of the models we teach so that they can use them in a robust way, right? And the last dimension would be static versus dynamic. Would we only want our students to be able to analyze and work with the here and now, what is now, refining and honing that? Or would we want our students to be able to do that and create new things, create new models, new ways of doing things, and be innovative? Clearly, we'd want to have them be the latter. So I'd say business education would be doing a great job if it was broad, not shallow, broad, not narrow, deep, not shallow, and dynamic, not static. So the question is, how would I rank today's business education, the mainstream of today's business education? There are obviously going to be exceptions on all these dimensions, but where would I rate business education, let's say in North America for the most part, along these dimensions? And this is what my view would be. Where it should be broad, it is narrow. Where it should be deep, it's shallow. Where it should be dynamic, it is static. And that, I would say, in a nutshell, is why people are questioning business education these days to the extent they are. These cracks, if you will, are becoming more and more obvious. So why do I say it's shallow where it should be deep? Well, I think that's because, to too great an extent, MBA education these days imparts models to students who want the takeaways. What's the formula? What's the model? We give it to them, and then they go out in the world and practice that using that model, whether or not that model actually applies to the situation at hand or not, right? So Fisher Black and Myron Scholes, clever finance professors, figure out what's the way to value an option. Black-Scholes option pricing theory. They have deep understanding of the matter and say, you know, this model is for valuing a European call option of less than 6 months duration on a non-dividend paying stock. For any other option, it is a bad approximation, and please don't use this model. What do you think the Black-Scholes option pricing theorem is used for these days? All options. Puts, calls, short-term, long-term, dividend-paying stock, non-dividend-paying, everything. All executive compensation is valued using the Black-Scholes. The FASB actually requires the use of the Black-Scholes option pricing theorem to value stock options for dividend-paying stocks for programs that are 3 years long, blah, 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 blah. Right? Lots of other kind of problems. We had lots of people creating tranches of asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, and they didn't actually bother to understand it well enough to know that the thinner you make the tranches, the more correlated the risk is within the tranche. That just wasn't in the models, right? Why? Because we had people with a shallow understanding of models. Why? It's because business education does not insist on depth. Narrow versus broad. I would argue business education teaches narrowness. How does it teach narrowness? On a number of dimensions. It teaches individual disciplines as if no other discipline existed. Right? So it teaches finance as if no other discipline exists. Then when you're done with that, you go over to marketing and teach that as if and learn about that as if no other discipline existed, et cetera, et cetera. So across individual disciplines, it's narrow, not broad. Also, complicating things like things outside shareholder value creation, the profit maximization, because they're kind of complicating, tend to be left off to the side or taught separately from the bulk of what we teach. So we take a narrow little box called The Business of Business is Business, Milton Friedman, 1970, and then take that box and divide it into little pieces and teach those little pieces. We don't say, what's the bigger box, like the role of business in society? How about that? How about other forms of business, social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, right? And if the world of business education actually teaches those, they teach them in an independent way that doesn't link them to the narrower box called the business of business is business. Okay? And finally, the one that relates most to design is static versus dynamic. What I'd argue is that we teach students in business schools how to analyze the here and now and choose from among existing options. We make them great at, if given option A and option B, they have all sorts of tools for calculating the net present value of one, the IRR of one, the risk-adjusted returns of one versus the other, and saying, you know what, B is much better than A, let's do B. We do not systematically teach them models, tools, and techniques for saying, what about a C? What about a C that's like kind of better than A and B? Which would be the dynamic approach, saying we're not here to hone and refine the here and now, we're here to create something better. It is because that blue box is little that business education is under, I think, its biggest threat that it's faced in its history since 1908, the opening of the doors of Harvard Business School, the birthplace of graduate business education. Because it is narrow, shallow, and static. And that's not a good thing. Does it have to be this way? Well, and the other challenge, for those of you who don't know the statistics, this country, America, makes an unbelievably big investment in business education, especially MBA education. 27% of all graduate students in America are in an MBA program. 22% of all people who get a university degree, whether undergraduate or graduate, per year in this country are getting a business degree. That is as big as all the natural sciences, medical, biological sciences put together. So we're making a gigantic investment in business education, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. 450,000 undergraduate and graduate degrees in business given out per year. What does that mean to me? A couple things. One is, you don't graduate 450,000 of anything for long unless those people are getting jobs. You know, if there were only 300,000 jobs for those 450,000 people, it would shrink. So somehow the country is sopping up those at a rate of 450,000 a year, or 150,000 a year for MBAs. So I'd argue the economy kind of needs them, but we're underperforming for that economy. Are we giving the economy absolutely what it needs? No, I don't think so. So is this the way it has to be? Would be my view. Absolutely not. And we are working assiduously away at this as a goal. This is what we call the 3D MBA. We want to have an MBA that's broad, deep, and dynamic. And I don't think it's undoable at all. In fact, I'd argue it's doable, and we're doing it. And I think lots of other people are doing pieces of this, including this fine establishment here. What are we doing on the shallow versus deep? We are teaching our MBA students how to understand models. That's the first thing we teach them when we get there. We don't teach them specific models. We understand them, what models are, how they operate, how to audit models, how to understand when they're being taught a model, whether they should buy that model, and if they don't like that model, how to modify it, change it, enhance it, so they can challenge every model that they're used, and they are given the opportunity to get good at being a model builder. We don't want them to be shallow, and we think this is important, as important, if not more important, than any model that they're going to learn. One. Narrow versus broad. We are making sure, one, with the Desautels Center of Integrative Thinking, to teach them the discipline of integrating across models. Right? There's all this stuff out there about how important interdisciplinary work is, and we got to do interdisciplinary stuff, but there's very little teaching of models for being interdisciplinary. Right? So academics tend to think that the disciplines, the individual disciplines, finance, marketing, operations are disciplines, and interdisciplinarity is a skill. It's not, it's a discipline. We're teaching it. We're developing new theory. We have a wonderful man named Marcel Desautels who's given us $40 million to develop the theory and teach the theory of interdisciplinarity. One. Two, we're making sure that our students see a broader definition than business. And so we've got the AIC Center for Corporate Citizenship creating new theory and models for integrating that broader vision into the world of business. Not saying we have to teach them the world of business, the business of business is business, shareholder value maximization, you do that, and then you take a course on CSR. No. You've got to have models that enable them to integrate those things together, or else they're just not very useful at all. We've also got something called the Martin Prosperity Institute that's headed up by the wonderful man named Richard Florida, who is doing fundamental work and analysis on how to help students understand what role they need to play as executives eventually in making sure the jurisdiction they live in, their company contributes to it and gets the contribution back from being a more competitive company because of what they've done to make it a better jurisdiction, a better place for people to live, work, raise their families, invest, enjoy. All of those things designed to make sure that our students come out saying business is a broad role in society, and we can make decisions that integrate those. And I will say, at risk of going on a little bit of a tangent here, I am very worried about and chagrined about business schools now that are asking their students to take an oath that they're going to go out into the world and do more than profit maximize, that they're going to be contributors to society. Why would I be worried about that? Because they're given no theory and no tools to do that. Angel Cabrera is a friend of mine, and he's got this oath now at Thunderbird, and I think it's a bad idea. I think that's more problematic than the students doing it themselves at Harvard, which is a bad idea, but students can do whatever they want because they're young and they'll learn. We can only have different behavior with actionable tools and models. And it is irresponsible to ask students to sign an oath to behave in a fashion that they're not taught the tools, techniques, practical ways of behaving. And the academy, the Business Academy, has done a crummy job thus far of creating actionable tools for thinking more broadly than the business of business is business. So we need to do a better job on that. Third dimension, narrow versus, static versus dynamic. On this front, what the Rotman School is doing is taking the best of design education and fusing it with the best of business education to teach our students, rather than to be choosers from among models, to be able to create new models, to innovate new solutions, new models to problems. And again, the key here, I think, is to infuse it into business education, design into business education, not set them side by side, because students need, again, actionable models for doing that. Now, why is this such a challenge for business education? It's a huge challenge for business education because business education is oriented around and dedicated to analytical thinking, which is deductive and inductive logic. If you look at a business school curriculum and in an average business school and ask what forms of logic underpin everything that is taught, not most things, not almost everything, everything that's taught, And it's either deductive logic, the logic of what should be, or inductive logic, the logic of what is currently operating. Are these useless forms of logic? No, no, they are very helpful. But there is one problem with those. And a very clever, but sort of nutty, turn of the 20th century American pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanford Peirce came up with a rather clever thought, which is as follows. You cannot demonstrate that any new idea in the history of the world has ever been created by way of inductive or deductive logic. Fairly bold assertion, but it's kind of hard to refute. So, what do we know about an educational system that teaches only inductive and deductive logic? Well, to provide tools and techniques, ways of working for its students for creating new ideas. No. So it is no surprise that business education produces folks who, by and large, go out into the world and hone and refine what currently exists. Make incremental, modest improvements on what currently exists by regressing the past to kind of predict the future. And that is why, MBAs get a bad rap for not being creative, not doing new things, for administering business, not designing business. Right? And the problem, the problem is what you need to advance business is you need to move across this funnel of knowledge. So in the world, things come to our attention first as mysteries. Right? Everything that we know now was once a mystery. If I drop this, it'll fall, right? At one point, we wondered, why the heck does that happen? And why do leaves fall slowly and why do birds not fall? Or famously, why do apples fall? That's a mystery. In due course, somebody who looks at that mystery comes up with a heuristic, a way of understanding that. There's a universal force called gravity. It's an imperfect understanding of it, but it helps us get past the mystery to that which is a way of understanding of how to get to the answer. In due course, if there's enough work and enough thinking and enough cleverness, we can get to the point of an algorithm, right? Which says, actually, if I drop this, it accelerates at 32 feet per second squared at ocean level. And we can actually predict with startling consistency how every object will fall in every circumstance, right? The kind of thinking that is required to get from mystery to heuristic or heuristic to algorithm is not inductive and deductive logic. Though the scientists would like to tell us that it is not. It is what Charles Sanford Peirce called a logical leap of the mind, an inference to the best explanation, something that you cannot prove in advance. You cannot prove in advance. You can only demonstrate its validity through the passage of time, through testing it and having time pass. And it's a form of logic he called abductive logic, a third form of logic. So deductive and inductive logic are for honing and refining within the heuristic stage. So many companies operate on the basis of heuristics. A high-end law firm, commercial law firm, doing deals and transactions. They've got a bunch of folks running a heuristic. Is it an algorithm? Can they write down the exact steps that every transaction takes? No. But they can, through the passage of time, get ever better at that heuristic by honing and refining it gently, by saying, I've done 10 transactions and they kind of all started this way and went that way. Brand management at Craig Wynett, my dear friend Craig Wynett's firm, is a heuristic. Is there an algorithm for how you create a brand that people absolutely love? No. There's a heuristic, though. There's a set of rules, guidelines, systems that would help you get in that direction. Right? That's what the analytical thinking that we teach helps do. Hone and refine within the existing knowledge domain, not move across the knowledge domain. If we actually want new ideas, we've got to teach a different kind of thinking. And there is this problem. And that is that the world is full of people who are at odds with one another. There are all these analytical thinkers, MBAs and other such folks, who want to rigorously use inductive and deductive logic to analyze what is and how to hone and refine that, in essence, to administer business. Then there are these wacky creative types, right, who use intuitive thinking, right? That is knowing without reasoning, knowing without explicitly reasoning or knowing why you know. And both of these types of people don't understand one another. So, right, the intuitive thinkers think the analytical thinkers are sticks in the mud and boring and dull, and the analytical thinkers think the intuitive thinkers are dangerous and deadly. And so they get invited in every once in a while, the intuitive thinkers, when everything is ground to a halt, but mainly not listened to, right? Because they're dangerous. What we are doing at the Rotman School is teaching design thinking, which is the intersection of these two things, right? Which is the ability to use and do inductive and deductive reasoning, but also add to that abductive reasoning, right? Not just being an analyst, nor not just being utterly creative, because the intuitive thinkers who come up with a creative leap that gets them from a mystery to a heuristic, or a heuristic to an algorithm, but can't replicate it, are not maximally useful. What's maximally useful is somebody who can tap into both, and we're teaching people that at the Rotman School, and it's eminently teachable, and I am, if anybody's interested in it at the subsequent session, I'll talk through how we're teaching that to our students in greater detail. But that is the third dimension, going from static to dynamic. And so, for what it's worth, that's what we're attempting to do at the Rotman School: create the 3D MBA, broad, deep, and dynamic. And I would tell all of you, it is utterly doable, and we're doing it. And I think it's the future of business education, not just what we're doing, but I think schools that in their own way push those three dimensions are going to invent the future of business education. And if they do that, we'll see this as the premier graduate degree in America and the world, 50 years from now. If we don't, it'll be dead 50 years from now. So with that, I will bring it to a close. Thanks a whole bunch.